Patch 1.13 has now arrived, and with it has brought a bunch of new buffs and nerfs. So for today, we're just going to read through all of the patch notes. I did do some testing for some of these things already, but for the most part, this is just going to be like a reaction and a little bit of a breakdown in real time. But yeah, start off with the PvP exclusive adjustments. Poise damage values for all of these different types of weapons have just now been increased. The increased poise damage of the Claws of Night throwing attacks also, that's probably just for like the heavy attacks, not necessarily the weapon skill. And the Crucible or the Fine Crucible Feather Talisman has now been nerfed in terms of the backstep and vulnerability window. The skills, Savage Lion's Claw, the second hit is now easier to land. I'll zoom this in a little bit. Decreased damage animation for the first attack against other players. Raging Beast, decreased invulnerability window against other player attacks. This is the skill of the Beast Claws. Blind Spots, decrease invulnerability window against other players. Don't worry, these things have not been changed in PvE. So if you're worrying about the iframes being worse, that is not the case. Decreased poise amount when charging this skill, so you're going to get staggered out of it easier, and you're not going to be able to like dodge attacks as easy with these types of skills. As for the spells, decrease the invulnerability window against other players' attacks with Miriam's Vanishing, and Knight's Lightning Spear now gets more damage on the initial spear, but decrease attack power for the other ones that follow it, and decrease poise damage for those things as well. Now, as for the general balancing adjustments, increased damage animation of the light greatsword charge attacks against other enemies. So yeah, like the light greatswords just do a bit more damage now with the charged heavy attacks, which is great because they already did have some decent synergy with the multi-hit talismans, and they already did just as much stance damage as greatswords. Increase the stats and status for the following NPCs in the summons. So these are just now buffed when they actually use them as summons. Increase the attack power and damage negation of summon spirits, including excluding the Mimic tier, with the Revered Spirit Ashes is at +5 or more, and basically the same thing when at +8 or higher. So, but all your summons and Spirit Ashes have just now been buffed. So if you actually are using that type of build, this is just now better for you. As for the weapons, the Shield of Night actually now gets increased damage negation with blocking physical attacks. I literally talked about this in yesterday's video. It went from 50% to 60%. The Euphoria is now buffed, and it basically is an S tier weapon. I did lots of testing with it, not lots, like about for like an hour. It is very solid now. Increase the holy damage when the weapon has its luster restored. So when you actually get a bunch of hits, it does buff the weapon. The first buff actually gives you +100 damage, and the second buff gives you additional +50, which is like twice as effective. Decrease the number of hits it requires to actually buff the weapon, which is basically cut in half. Beforehand, you had to do like 6 light attacks or 2 charged heavy attacks. Now you only need to do 3 light attacks and 1 charged heavy attack. And to buff it a second time, it's an additional 3 lights or an additional charged heavy. And the decaying effect is like way worse as well. And the buff just lasts like over like a minute 30 seconds and actually can be increased as long as you constantly attack. So it is so easy to actually buff the weapon now. You get more damage when you have it buffed, and the buff just like lasts forever. So like it is basically an S tier weapon now. All the things that I had problems with have basically just been like just fixed. This is now like the highest damaging twin blade in the game, and this is probably going to be the best one. Very solid S tier weapon. I'll probably end up making a build around this sometime soon. The Golden Lion Shield, increase guard strength. This is basically the guard boost. I talked about this in yesterday's video as well. It went from 55 guard boost to 63 guard boost, which is actually very decent. Still not as much as the Brass Shield or the Mesmer Soldier Shield. The Golem Fist now actually has a hitbox with the weapon directly, so at point blank range you're going to be doing a lot more damage and more stance damage. For my testing, it is about 30 stance damage, which is like somewhat similar to like a regular fist attack, so that is very nice. The Smith Script Great Hammer now gets increased poise damage for the swing portion, and that is not stance damage, by the way. That is poise damage. That means that they can actually get staggered a lot better. So this basically has a lot more stun locking potential. The Spread Crossbow did actually get nerfed to status effect buildup. So before you actually could just use it at point blank and it could do a whole bunch of status buildup, but now that is no longer the case. After the onset of a status ailment, the status buildup or duration of said ailment will now be reduced immediately by a certain amount. So typically how this talisman works is that when you get hit by a status effect, you gain a bunch more resistances, but the bar doesn't actually go down, but now it actually does. The Clarifying Horn Charms have now been buffed. Our focus is things like your madness and sleep. So for those types of things, it's just now better. So when you're going through the Abyssal Woods, these are just going to be better for you. Now, as for the skills and Ashes of War, Savage Lion's Claw gets increased attack power and poise damage of the first attack. Now, that is just going to be somewhat more in line with Lion's Claw. Typically, just spamming regular Lion's Claw was just always better in terms of just damage and stance damage. But now this actually might end up being the better option if you do have like those longer openings. It's still not going to do as much damage or as much stance damage as Lion's Claw in the first attack, but it actually does do like 27 stance damage now. And the entire combo can actually do 60 stance damage. That is actually if you're using larger types of weapons. So it actually is a lot better now. Swift Slash has been gotten nerfed, reduced movement distance when using the skill, and extended recovery time. So it's not as easily spammed and you don't really go as far. But the damage is still there. It still does a really good status build up. And in PvE, I just tested out a little bit. It's pretty decent. I don't really have any problems with it. But I still think it's an S tier skill. Overhead stance now gets increased attack power against enemies. I wish it got more stance damage because I think something like repeating thrust or blood tax is still going to be the best option for the great katanas. Because I feel like the thing that it lacks is the stance damage, because even like regular unsheath on a katana can do more, because overhead stance, the stance damage of it, the triple swinging attack at least, is like 25 stance damage. It's really not that good, but at least it does get more damage now. Aspect of the Crucible Wings now actually gets more damage, increased directional control, and more hyper armor. So it's just an overall just better skill. You can tank more attacks, you can track with it easier, and you get more damage. All things that are must needed changes. Light Speed Slash. The additional light attack are now affected by the attack power and ability scaling of the weapon, which this is just fantastic. Those holy projectiles now just scale off AR, and that is going to be doing a really good damage. Rancor Slash has now been improved. Those little skulls that come out at the end of Rancor Slash do a bit more damage, and they actually get more stamina damage against guarded enemies. I still wouldn't really care to use it much over something like Sword Dance, because like it's like the same thing, but that can just do a bit more damage in general. And it could proc Frost faster as well, but this thing actually does do a bit more stance damage, so that's okay. Revenge's Blade, which is a skill of the Falx, now actually gets better tracking with a follow-up attack. So you actually can like 180 with it or turn it a lot better than you used to. So if you were trying to hit multiple enemies with this skill, it's now just a lot better. Horn Calling and Horn Calling Storm of the Horned Warrior Swords are just now just doing more damage, which is just fantastic. Horn Calling is actually a pretty decent skill. Does get some good hyper armor. It goes pretty far. My biggest problem is that it did consume a lot of stamina, but the fact that it's doing more damage now, I'm not going to complain. Horn Calling Storm, I never really liked it much more than Stormcaller because it has better stun locking potential, because it is just quicker, which that still is going to be the case, but the fact that it does get more damage now is obviously going to be nice as well. Weed Cutter actually now gets increased speed of attacks. I did actually notice that the first part or the first swing was actually a lot faster. So actually getting into the attacks was actually pretty decent. And this is going to result in just even more DPS. This thing is already cheap and gets high amounts of hyper armor. So like, yeah, this weapon has just gotten even better, which is fantastic. Ramina's Purification of the Pole Blade of the Bud now gets hyper armor when using the skill, which is great. It's still not going to be like infinite hyper armor. It's still going to be like a longer animation, but at least you're actually not going to get staggered out of it. Red Bear Hunt of the Red Bear's Claw gets more damage and now gets hyper armor, which is just insane. Like, this thing was already like a really good skill. It did amazing damage and actually did like stun lock enemies, did high amounts of bleed. The only thing that it was lacking was hyper armor for it to be like an S tier, but now it gets a damage buff and hyper armor. So yeah, this thing is actually going to be insane now. Rancor Shot decrease status build-up generation when using arrows that have status effects, which this is unfortunate. The Bone Bow was really good because it is basically like Barrage, but it had insane tracking, so it went really far. It just like never missed. And yeah, with these status arrows, it could have just procced it really quick. So that's now nerfed, but it is still going to be a pretty solid bow. Repeating Fire adjusted attack power to compensate for an increase in weapon damage, which is great. The repeating crossbow just got even better. I wish that the stamina cost wasn't as high still. And the animation could have been a bit faster as well, but the fact that we get more damage, not going to complain. Feeble's Lord's Frenzied Flame reduced the frenzy status effect build-up against enemies. That's going to be useless in PvE, but obviously that's just a nerf in PvP. Revenge of the Night increased poise damage and attack power when using this skill immediately after guarding. Now this is off the Shield of Night, which I talked about in yesterday's video. When you block with this weapon and use the skill, it does like a special guard counter projectile attack, and now it went from 10 stance damage to 15 stance damage, and it just gets a bit more attack power as well, which is great. Unfortunately, it still does not work with things like the Deflect tier or the Curve Sword Talisman. That would have been nice, but yeah, I'm not going to complain about this. Anyway, spells. Glint Blade Trio now just gets a bit more damage. As for how much, I'm not really too sure. They don't really tell us. That's unfortunate. Blade of Stone, which is already a pretty decent spell, has just gotten better. Adjusted attack power for the first, second, and third charge attacks. Increase for the non-charge attack, which is great because when this thing is not charged, it's kind of just shit. Increase attack power for the first hit of the charge attack and reduced attack power for the second and third hits. Increased attack range and attack speed. So I think overall this is just a much better change for the Blades of Stone. Probably going to be one of the better physical types of spells in the game now. Glintstone Nails and Glintstone Nail just get better tracking and just more damage. can't complain. Glintstone Nails was already an amazing skill with really good tracking, so the fact that those things have just been improved is really good. Impenetrable Thorns has in fact gotten a hefty nerf. All generated impenetrable thorns will now track enemies. I never really noticed like the tracking much because obviously when using this spell, you went like close range and it's like just destroyed everything. Yeah, decreased attack power and poise damage, decreased the bleed status effect build up, and stamina damage against guarded enemies. And this is by a considerable amount. It still is a decent spell to use, but it's obviously nowhere near as good as it once was because it was basically game breaking. It could like just one-shot so many enemies very easily for like only 15 FP. It was just kind of ridiculous. But it is no longer going to do that amazing damage at point blank range. The bleed buildup went from like over 600 bleed to about 150 bleed buildup. But the fact that it is still very easily spammable, the fact that it can go very far, the damage itself is not that bad either. It is just like a direct upgrade of the Briars of Punishment spell. So it still is going to be a very solid like bleed projectile option for like your sorcery builds. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to get much use as it does have like a higher faith requirement. And if you're using a sorcery build, you're probably not going to have much faith. But if you do have like those intelligence faith builds, this is still going to be very useful. Rings of Spectral Light increased attack power and frost status buildup, as well as the Vortex of Putrescence. It's not that much different from my testing. It was like an extra like 50 frost buildup, which is still decent. It's going to like proc frost like a bit quicker. It might take like one less extra hits than normal. Also, if you did want to know, the Rings of the Spectral Light still does not work with the Prince of the Death Staff, so it's not going to really gain that benefit of that. As for the incantations, minor Erdtree does this get more HP. Lando Shadow now just gets improved enemy tracking, which that is good. It was like a very like long range type of spell, so maybe it's just better just hitting those enemies like to move around instead, which is great. I still wouldn't really use it at point blank range because it is like a very like long animation. Spira now gets increased attack speed, but you still don't get hype armor, and I still think the damage is not really worth it. I just wish that like you could probably like walk around with it, maybe. I don't know. I still don't really like the spell that much. Watchful Spirits gets improved enemy tracking. It needed a lot more than that. Like this spell is god tier awful. Like the damage is horrendous. It needed more than enemy tracking. It needed like to have 10 times more damage, shoot it out like way faster, have like, I don't know. It just needed something. Improved enemy tracking ain't it. Divine Beast Tornado now gets more damage, and enemies hit by the tornado will actually get launched upwards, which is great. The tornado will be less likely to disappear due to collision, which is also very great. So actually can go through certain types of like terrain, like rocks or whatnot, and it is going to like just launch enemies upwards, which can result in like a nice stun lock against those smaller enemies. Unfortunately, like the point blank range, it still doesn't get like a hitbox. So if you wanted to like stagger enemies at closer ranges, it's still not going to work. Rain of Fire has now been buffed as well to where it's actually respectable damage. It's still not going to be like the most amazing damaging option, but the whole purpose of a spell like this is to use it at the beginning of the fight, walk towards the enemy, and while they're getting rained on by this fire, you can just hit them with your weapons, and it's going to be some like nice passive damage over time. Ideally, you'd want to use it against like large immobile types of bosses, because against smaller, quicker enemies, it's probably just going to miss. And if you did want like a nice damaging fire AoE attack, Bono Flame is going to just do this way better. But as I mentioned, it's just going to be somewhat decent now. Still very niche, but nowhere near as bad as it once was. Roar of Regalia now gets increased poise damage and attack power. The damage has basically like increased by twice the amount, but twice the amount of not much is still not going to be much. And as for the poise damage, it does like a bit over 30 stance damage, which is okay. Like the whole purpose of this spell is to like stun lock enemies, but like I wouldn't really care to use it. I just feel like it needs a lot more damage. Like it just needs it. Like the damage output is still not there. Furious Blade of Unspark though now actually gets more damage, and they actually did fix the bleed as it probably go like over in the patch notes. But yeah, it actually does do blood loss build up right now. And I have my notes here. Actually does do 180 blood loss build up when uncharged, and fully charged is 250, which is actually very solid. And it actually might be one of the better like bleed types of spells to use now, because it could probably just proc bleed faster than Blood Flame Talons, but it is going to be like a longer animation. You don't get hyper armor. It does get a higher arcane requirement, so it's not really like viable with faith types of builds. And if you have like an arcane build, you're more likely than not already have like bleed. But if you don't have a bleed weapon with your arcane build, then this is going to be a very solid option. And Rotten Butterflies has also gotten buffed. It goes a lot further. The rot buildup is a lot higher as well. It does like upwards of 600 rot, and the AoE is actually very large. So it actually is very comparable to Scarlet Aeonia now. Scarlet Aeonia is still going to get way more damage. It's probably going to be more consistent, and it does do more rot buildup. But this one actually does do it in a wider AoE. And it actually is only going to take up 1 slot, where Scarlet Aeonia takes up 3 slots. So this one actually does have a lot more uses now. As for the ashes, the spirit ashes, yeah, I ain't reading every single one of these, but will no longer stagger as easily. All these things have been buffed. I'm going to link these notes down below. Hopefully it brings them more in line to things like Mimic Tier, because everyone just used the Mimic Tier, which is just fantastic. The fact that Jalan and Ana actually got buffed, it's actually really good. But yeah, I ain't reading all that, but I'll just skim through it a little bit. Black Knife Tish got buffed as well. Ancient Dragon Florisax, other types of like Spirit Ashes that are really good. So that's amazing. Did it actually say anything about the skill that it used? Increased skill and incantation usage rate. That is actually really good, because the skill actually does debuff enemies to make them take more lightning damage. So that is very useful. Anyway, bug fixes. Change the default selection to OK cancel prompt when show up with a Spectral Steed Whistle while the Spectral Steed is dead. That is fantastic. That is such a great change. That is great. Adjusted the placement of NPC summon signs in certain boss fight areas. Don't know which one those are going to be. I changed the NPC summon signs in certain boss fights to allow the user to summon NPCs simply by pressing the action button once. Oh, wow. That's really cool. So you can just press it one time and then they get summoned. I fixed the bug where the damage of some of the normal attacks of the Dark Moon Greatsword were lower than intended. I didn't really notice that from my playtesting of it. The physical attack attribute display of the War Pick weapon. That's been like how long? They just fixed it right now. Yeah, this thing is supposed to be doing piercing damage. It does do piercing damage, but it doesn't actually say that. But now it should say that, I guess. Fixed the bug where some of the attacks of the Swift Spear weapon were different than expected in terms of power, damage motion, and hitbox generation timing. I didn't notice that. I kind of wish they buffed the Swift Spear to be like a bit faster between attacks, because there still like is a little bit of a delay that I don't really care for. I fixed the bug that prevented the Twin Blade Talisman from affecting the Perfume Bottle's weapon type when equipped and used in the left hand. That is very specific and niche. Fixed the bug where the physical attack attributes of some of the weapons with thrusting shields were different than expected. I wish they specified. Fixed the bug that allowed the use of arrows, great arrows. Yeah, it was that the chainsaw glitch they're talking about? Maybe. I fixed the bug where the effect increasing... Okay, yeah, so Light of MIQUELLA now actually works with the Circlet of Light, which that means it's 10% more damage to the Light of MIQUELLA. Because the Circle of Light does actually give you a 10% buff. Now, for people thinking that actually should be working with the Dryleaf Seal, I actually got the game open right here. The Dryleaf Seal used to say boost MIQUELLA incantations, and now it actually changed it to say boost Golden Ring of Light incantations. So they kind of doubled down into the Dryleaf Seal not boosting Light of MIQUELLA now. But if they did leave it the way it was, and it did make it boost the Light of MIQUELLA, that would have been 15% more damage to that spell. I kind of wish they did leave it like that. It would have been nice. 15% more damage to like Lights of MIQUELLA would have been like really cool. But I will take 10% more damage every single time. Fix the bug that caused the FP consumption when using the Unending Dance skill while not meeting the ability requirements. Okay. So when you just didn't have the requirements, it just still drained FP when it shouldn't have. That makes sense. I fixed the bug where the physical attack attribute of some of the attacks of Deadly Dance skill was different than intended. I wish they had specified some of these things. Fixed the bug though the physical attack attribute of Scattershot Throw skill of the Claws of Night was different than intended. I was actually playing around with the Claws of Night, and I feel like at further distances, it wasn't really getting that as good a damage. But at closer range, it was still getting, like, we're still hitting pretty hard. So I think this is just a straight up nerf to the Claws of Night. That is no longer as good as they used to be. I'm probably going to go, like, stream this, like, later tomorrow. It's, like, really late for me right now. So I'm probably going to go to bed. And then tomorrow, I'll go stream and go test out the Claws of Night. So that's pretty interesting. There was, like, a glitch where you could actually use one and switch to the other thing. And it did, like, a different skill. You ain't got to worry about that. That's now fixed. Fixed the bug that caused certain skills to perform differently than expected under... Okay, what does that mean? Like, this is so vague. Fixed a bug that caused certain skills to perform differently than expected under certain circumstances. Explain. Caused Golden Arc Incantation to generate attacks slower when casted with the left hand. Didn't know that. Rain of Fire Incantations did not hit enemies. That's great. There it is. The Ansbach, Furious Blade of Ansbach, now actually works with bleed, or actually now does bleed, which is great. I already covered that earlier. Fixed a bug where under some circumstances, the move distance when casting some spells. So this is just so, like, this is all pretty, like, just chill, small stuff. I ain't worrying about all that. Anyway, fixed the bug with the anti-aliasing quality. It was unintentionally set to high to each time the game was restarted. That was a thing. And this is possible unstable performance fixes. If you're having problems, go refer to this. I'll link this down below. Anyway, that is the entire everything done. My overall thoughts is that it's really good. There's still like a bunch of things that I would have liked to get buffed and fixed, but I am very satisfied with this. This is fantastic. I will do a lot of testing with all of these things tomorrow. As I mentioned, I'm probably going to go to bed soon. But definitely follow me on Twitch because I will be live and just be testing out all of this different types of stuff and making a bunch of builds. So that's going to be pretty cool. Anyway, just let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. And yeah, I'll catch you guys around. Bye.